All right, well, thank you so much for attending today's webinar. We have a bunch of you on already, so thank you for that. Today we'll be talking about top authentication questions. A few housekeeping items. We have about an hour today. All attendees are muted as usual. Enter your questions anytime in the Q&A area, if you could. We'll save some time at the end to address those. And this session is being recorded today. So we have two presenters. First up is Amanda Ferrante, the product manager of Authentication Solutions at EBSCO. And then we'll have Jake Wiles, the technical solutions expert at Open Athens. And let's get this started. I'm going to hand it over to Amanda.
Okay, great. Thank you, Kim. So just to introduce ourselves a little bit more before we get started, Jake and I are members of the Open Athens and EBSCO teams who collaborate in all matters pertaining to our clients' authentication. And to date, we've worked directly with libraries to provide technical consultation and guidance, but also to help set up and launch the Open Athens service. And today's session is really the culmination of that shared experience and lesson learned by all of our teams. We've identified the most commonly asked about topics we hear when speaking with libraries and their technical teams, and we plan to walk through all of those today. So just to do a high-level overview of what we intend to cover, our session will start with a brief overview of the Open Athens single sign-on service, so what it is, the problems it looks to solve, and some of its technical specifications. And when talking about what Open Athens is, we find that it's really helpful to actually lay out how it aims to change the experience for all of the stakeholders involved. So those are the questions we'll really be focusing on today. How will Open Athens change the experience for the end user, for the librarian, and for the IT team? And from there, we'll give a high-level overview of how an implementation progresses to help point out those components on the timeline where IT assistance is typically needed and what those components entail. And finally, we'll end our session by covering those most frequently asked questions about Open Athens technical configuration, and we'll leave time at the end for any questions we haven't covered yet. So to kick us off, I will hand things over to Jake.
Great, thanks Amanda. Hi everyone, I'm Jake Wiles and I'm a technical solutions expert over at Open Athens. So to kick us off, I'm just going to go over a bit of the basics of Open Athens and kind of where it all came from. So Open Athens is an identity and access management service. It's supplied by JISC and we're based in the UK. We're also a not-for-profit company. In a nutshell, we provide software that allows your patrons to use a single username and password to access all of the subscribed content from an organization. So there's this little diagram here about the why, how, and what. So with the why, we want to remove barriers to knowledge and let people sign in a lot easier to resources. We're doing that by providing a robust and reliable solution, as sometimes called this gateway between the subscription-based content and people who actually need to access it. And yes, we're a single sign-on software, so we do that with SAML. So if I could get the next slide, please, Amanda. So yes, a little bit more into what is Open Athens. So when I say single sign-on service, what I'm really talking about is one username and password to access all of the content that your organization subscribes to. And once you've logged in once, then that's it. Any other provider you go to, when you hit sign in with your institution, you're just straight in. You don't have to put in your password again. So a really nice fluid user experience for your users. We're entirely cloud hosted. So cloud hosted identity and access management suite. And we have a dashboard called the Open Athens admin area, which allows you to access like management settings to define different permissions and categorize your users and set up resources, cool stuff like that. So we'll be having a little look at that later on. So the admin area also gives you granular usage reporting. So based on different attributes of your users, you can get different reports. And we're going to go over that as well later on, seeing how flexible that is. And then we also have integration with local systems. So you can use familiar accounts to sign into online resources. So if you're using like ADFS or G Suite or something like that, your users are probably familiar with logging into their school or work computers with ADFS. So they can reuse that same account to log into online resources. And that makes that goal of single sign-on really, really nice, because they don't have to remember a separate password for Open Athens itself. So if we could get the next one. Thanks, Amanda. So a little bit about the technical stuff. So it's built upon the SAML 2.0 protocol. Don't worry if you don't know anything about that. The reason why we're hosted is that we look after all of the SAML stuff for you, so you don't have to understand it. We're a federated single sign-on and hosted proxy service. So that's kind of interesting because at heart, we're all about federated single sign-on. So that's the whole logging into resources once and then going to other resource providers and being able to sign in with that same password. But there's a need as well for a proxy service because not all publishers are SAML compliant. So we actually host a proxy service which you get access to with your with Open Athens. So yeah, as I mentioned before, we've got the integration with local identity providers. So that's reusing like your ADFS or LDAP, or if you want to make API calls to us, or even if you have a different product like G Suite, which uses SAML. So yeah, we can hook into a bunch of different identity provider software. And if you have any questions about any specific identity providers, and let us know and we can have a look at for you. Yep, so we actually support login to content, application, and tools. So it's not just about resources. If you have like internal tools or applications like Moodle and stuff like that, then you can actually log into Moodle with like an Open Athens account. So you can put everything behind Open Athens, which is really nice. There's no requirement for PII, which is personal data. So we'll get a bit more into detail about this later on, but the nutshell is that you can send as less or as much as you want to Open Athens, and that control is with your local system. So we have library controls about attribute release during authentication handshake. And what that really means is you actually control from the Open Athens dashboards who gets what information about your users. So you get granular control of, say, sending your email address of your end users to a certain publisher and not sending it to everyone else. And you get to control and manage what attributes get released to who. You also get like a core set as well. So everyone gets the non-identifying stuff, and then you can expand that. So if you actually wanted to send your email to a specific publisher, then you can set that up pretty easy in Open Athens. And like I've been saying, yeah, we're a fully cloud-based service. We run everything on Google Clouds, and we're yeah, all over the place really. So that's pretty nice. You don't have to worry about installing anything locally on your end. You can hook in your existing systems into Open Athens, and then we do all the hard work about looking after the SAML and the single sign-on handshakes and stuff like that. Cool, great. That's all for this part, Amanda.
All right. So we'll jump into some information about how Open Athens changes the experience for all of the folks related to your teams who help manage or use authentication. So for the end user, first and foremost, the most foundational intended change is to make it easier for them to log into your electronic resources or your applications, or like Jake said, any tools that you use, such as Moodle or perhaps an interlibrary loan service, something like that. Open Athens does support a single sign-on user experience across any of those resources as long as they accept SAML or IP access. And that goes back to the framework behind Open Athens, which is federated SAML single sign-on. But for anything that doesn't accept SAML yet, we have that hosted proxy service. And many libraries do choose to connect Open Athens to their existing directory of user accounts or their identity provider, which means that that initial login prompt to the single sign-on service will be for an account that the end user is already familiar with and already accustomed to using. So if your patrons, your end users, your students and faculty and staff, if they're accustomed to logging into your organizational applications with, say, their G Suite account or their Active Directory account, then that will be the account that they're first prompted to log in with when they encounter the Open Athens access point. And as Jake already mentioned, Open Athens is fully web-based, which means that it can be used wherever people are conducting their research. So it can be used in any location and from any device. And finally, Open Athens offers that robust usage reporting module. And we will jump into reports and a live dashboard a little bit later on. So a lot of what we're talking about now is something that we'll actually see a live demo for in a few minutes. I will note that reporting obviously is not something that's typically directly visible to your end users, but it does have a really direct effect on them because increased access to granular data can help the library track user preferences, some of their behaviors, maybe what platforms they're gravitating toward more than others. And ultimately that just helps inform decisions that you're making that impact their research experience. Now, as for the librarians and the administrators of your authentication, I think the changes that you would experience really boil down to increase in control, flexibility, and visibility. So again, Open Athens is built on that federated framework for the SAML single sign-on. And what that means from an administrative standpoint is that any metadata exchange that's required for single sign-on is actually managed behind the scenes by Open Athens team. And in the same vein, the proxy component, the hosted proxy service, that's completely taken care of behind the scenes by Open Athens team as well. They manage that configuration file for all of the proxy access. And so what this boils down to is an authentication service that supports both SAML and IP access, but that no longer requires a from scratch technical setup or management to connect to your publisher platforms. The idea is to make SAML single sign-on accessible and attainable for libraries without necessarily requiring a heavy reliance on their IT teams. So if you are a library who works with your IT to manage your authentication, and if either of your teams are currently managing metadata exchange or a configuration file, Open Athens aims to take that off your plate and manage all of those components behind the scenes. And from there, Open Athens also offers functionalities that are designed to really address the needs that we frequently hear of from libraries. So for example, permissions rules can be configured to say who has access to what. We do commonly hear that some libraries support different groups who have varying levels of authorization and access. So maybe walk-in users or perhaps alumni who should have access to some, but not all of your subscriptions. Open Athens can enforce rules to assign those permissions so that a person only has access to the subscriptions that they're included on the license for. The usage reporting module is also designed to give the type and granularity of data that libraries ask for. But we also know that lots of libraries, while they have a need for granular usage data, also have a need to retain anonymity or protect user privacy. So what we'll see when we jump into the reports and look at the IDP connection in a few minutes is that Open Athens does not require personally identifiable data, but can use other types of non-PII data to help you achieve some more granular visibility in your reports. And being that Open Athens is built upon the SAML 2.0 protocol, it can, in many cases, identify potential misuse down to the user level. So, for example, if my account is used to log in from Massachusetts and the UK in the same 10-minute period, a behavior that I think many people would consider potential misuse, the Open Athens service is designed to actually flag that behavior. In that specific use case, my account would be temporarily suspended by the service, and I would receive a notification as the end user, but the librarian and the administrator on my Open Athens account would also receive a notification. And the idea there is to put a temporary hold on anything that's identified as potential misuse, but also to notify any of the people who would be involved in investigating that misuse. So in that use case, the librarian could go ahead, check on what's going on, and if we've decided that it is not misuse, you can easily just re-enable access for the end user. So the idea is to have a little bit more of a targeted security protocol there and identify that misuse down to the user level rather than potentially seeing access shut down for an entire library. And finally, while most libraries do choose to connect their existing identity provider for account logins, we also know that libraries are sometimes required to provide access to users outside of their main user directory. So the most common instance in this is amongst academic libraries who might have a centralized identity provider that has accounts for all of their students, faculty, and staff. But who are mandated to support community access within the libraries, maybe walk-in users or guests, visiting lecturers, things like that. And so in those cases, if you need to support temporary one-off access for a user, Open Athens dashboard does give you some functionality to create a few different types of temporary accounts to support that access for somebody who doesn't have an account in your identity provider. And finally, our final stakeholder in the authentication configuration conversation is the IT team. What will change for you? Well, that federated framework and hosted proxy service also means that IT are no longer required to set up or maintain one-to-one SAML metadata connections for library resources or to maintain a proxy configuration file for library resources. So in many cases, what we hear is that this frees up some time for IT staff. And from there, we also hear that connecting to an existing identity provider is a win-win for everybody. One, because we're leveraging the work that IT already does to maintain that store of user accounts. Two, because this means that the library doesn't need to directly manage any user accounts. And three, obviously, because the end user gets to use the account they're already familiar with to log into the single sign-on service. And we'll cover this in more detail, but when we're talking about user accounts, it's important to mention that when we're connecting to an identity provider, Open Athens does not require any minimum of user data be shared with the service other than some unique persistent identifier. This means that if your IT team enforces a policy to share a minimum of PII or to not share any PII whatsoever, we can actually make sure that that's how the configuration is set up. We do work with lots of libraries who use Open Athens and achieve that authentication, authorization, personalization, but don't share any personal data whatsoever with the service. All right, and Jake, that is back to you.
Cool, thanks, Amanda. So yeah, next generation technology. So the RA21 pilot, if you've heard of it, that phase completed in early 2019. And there was a recommendations document that got published in June. So we're really close to this pilot. We're listening and stuff. And the conclusion from that pilot was that IP should be replaced by SAML in order to provide a more robust, secure solution for libraries and researchers. So we've got like this little diagram here that kind of shows the differences between using SAML and IP. So I'm going to start on the right-hand side. So with IP, the user will go to a proxy server, normally known as a forward proxy server, and that server will then talk to the publisher on behalf of a user. But the problem with that is that you have lots of people talking to that proxy server, and the publisher only sees that server. So if there was misuse on one of those accounts, either by mistake or a compromised user account for that proxy server, then a publisher could potentially block that IP address, and then you're going to block access to your entire organization. So yeah, it's not too great. There's some other things as well, like reporting. You can't really see who accessed what. I know you can with some products, but it can take a while. And normally, I hear libraries, they're going through like log files and you know, parsing them, and that's not great. From what I've heard at like conferences and stuff, like everyone does it in a slightly different way. So yeah, it's not too great. But we also recognize that there's a need for proxy because not all publishers do SAML. So even though it's not the best solution, it's still necessary. So the preferred solution, SAML, when the user logs in and does that SAML handshake to a publisher, an identifier is sent to a publisher called, in the Open Athens Federation, we call it the targeted ID. And this ID is a non-identifiable persistent user ID. So it's unique per publishers, and publishers can't trade these targeted IDs between themselves, so they can't track users. And the actual targeted ID is a string that doesn't contain anything like names or email addresses or anything like that. So with that targeted ID, when that gets passed to the publisher, if the publisher noticed that an account was downloading half their website or something like that, then they could actually block that individual user, report it to the library, and then the library could take an action on, you know, suspending the account or having a word with whoever that is. And they can, the library can work out with our support desk who that user is based on that targeted ID. So yeah, there's stuff in place for looking after that. So yeah, obviously, if the publisher blocks one user, then what's really good is that your entire organization doesn't get blocked. So everyone else still can access when that one user might just get blocked from that one publisher. So yeah, as I was saying, in the SAML handshake as well, when you actually pass over attributes, you can control what else gets sent. So targeted ID is one of our core attributes, but if you have a publisher that supports stuff like personalization, and they want to have something like saying your name when you access a website, like hello Jake Wiles or something like that, then they may ask you to send over additional attributes, and you can control that in the Open Athens admin area of who gets what. Could we go for the next one, please, Amanda?
Yes, I think this one is mine, actually.
Oh, yes. Oh.
All right. So next we want to talk about the Open Athens implementation process from a really high level. We're not going to do a deep dive into any of the step-by-step at this time, but if in the future you're interested in seeing that deeper dive of the implementation process, feel free to reach out to your EBSCO team and we can get you in touch with the right people. But today we really just want to identify the major cornerstone components of an Open Athens implementation, identify where those components sit on the timeline, sort of the order of operations, and most importantly, identify which teams are required to contribute to those parts of the setup. So the idea here being that if we need assistance from IT or technical staff during an Open Athens implementation, it's really helpful upfront to have an expectation of when we might need that assistance and what that assistance looks like. So if we boil it down, the two most integral parts of an Open Athens implementation are the connection to the organization's directory of user accounts, and then the connections we establish with each of the library's subscriptions vendors. Once we complete these two components, that allows the end user to log into the library's resources using their existing organizational account. So that really is the end user experience that we're going for. And as you might imagine, so this first component, the identity provider connection, that typically requires assistance from IT or whichever team manages that identity provider. If you have an IAM team or someone like that. Open Athens, as Jake mentioned earlier, can connect to a variety of different identity providers. The most common we see is a connection to a SAML compliant IDP. So that would be something like Microsoft Active Directory, Google Suite, things like that. We can also connect to identity applications like Ping, Okta, and so on. From there, Open Athens also supports a connection to an LDAP identity provider, but it also has an accounts management API. So if you store your user accounts in some application that isn't SAML compliant and isn't a type of Active Directory, but has an API available, you can connect it to Open Athens to pull in whatever data you choose to pass and create account logins that way. And so this is usually the primary component that we look to complete during an Open Athens implementation. Because from there, while we're contacting all your vendors and configuring logins, it's just helpful to be able to test that using an identity provider account. So during this stage, early on in an implementation, EBSCO's team works with the library and IT to let you know what's needed to establish that connection. And from there, the second item here is a little bit more library focused. We ask that the library provide our team with a list of the vendors where you purchase subscriptions from. This gives us some of the information that we need to reach out to those vendors and establish those new Open Athens logins. And during that time, during the implementation timeline, our team is not removing any existing authentication information. So for example, if you currently use IP access to access most of your subscriptions, our team during an implementation for Open Athens would be reaching out and adding Open Athens, but not changing or removing any of your existing access information. And finally, this third component that really represents the last cornerstone of an Open Athens setup is to launch Open Athens. And when we talk about launching it, we're really talking about updating the links that you use to access resources to use the Open Athens syntax. So this component might involve help from all groups working together to update links wherever they live. So our EBSCO implementation team has lots of experience working with libraries. So we've seen everything from global proxy settings in different types of software applications to find and replace in others, things like that. Now, speaking of your implementation team, it might be helpful just to know who at EBSCO works with our Open Athens subscribers. We do have a software as a service implementation team, and these are a team of dedicated technical product experts who work directly with our libraries to navigate implementations for any of the software as a service that we set up for libraries. During an Open Athens setup, the library will have a single point of contact from that team, who we call an implementation project manager, and they will be your point of contact for anything related to Open Athens. So they'll be assisting with that setup, obviously helping you navigate, answering questions, identifying next steps, and so on. But also they can point you toward any helpful training or documentation that our EBSCO and Open Athens teams have built for you. Now, the IPM might be the only person you speak with from EBSCO during the implementation, but they are backed up by our SaaS specialists who perform any technical configuration needed in the Open Athens dashboard. So for example, when we're connecting to an identity provider, you might be ingesting Open Athens SAML metadata in your IDP settings, but our SaaS specialists are helping ingest your IDP's metadata in Open Athens settings. And being that Open Athens is a close partner of EBSCO's, we do work very closely with them and their product experts like Jake here to support all of the conversations we have. And that includes the entire life cycle of the product, really, even so far as sharing feedback that we hear from you to help us improve and innovate. All right, back over to you, Jake.
Thanks, Amanda. So we got some frequently asked questions here. Just to remind everyone that we will be getting to the questions at the end anyway, but here's just a few frequently asked questions. So my library already uses single sign-on. Why would we need Open Athens? So Open Athens is designed to empower the library to manage its authentication by design. So historically, library access has been managed by the IT and requires one-to-one vendor outreach to set up, whether that's with SAML or Proxy, whatever. It also, requires to have like a proxy service alongside the library, and that could be managed by the IT. So we're trying to put the control of those systems into one central place for the librarian. So yeah, historically, it's all been outside of the library control with single sign-on. Open Athens offers a single dashboards, as I mentioned, where all authentication, so both SAML and IP, can be set up. Its federated access and hosted proxy service eliminates the need to exchange this metadata or configuration stanzas with individual providers. Open Athens does not require any configuration files or one-to-one SAML connections or management of them because we do that. And I can tell you, we have very big configuration files for Proxy and SAML. We also actually host the Open Athens Global Federation. So with SAML federations like UK Federation, In Common Federation, stuff like that, we host one called the Open Athens Federation, which is a global federation, and that's filled up with Open Athens identity providers and service providers. But we can also work with other federations if you wanted to join, like In Common, which is the US Federation, for example. So the next question here is, can we continue to use IP access for on-site users and only use Open Athens for remote users? So yeah, you can do that. Open Athens can defer to IP authentication for when a user is on campus. So that means sending the user directly to the publisher website without even touching Open Athens. On-site users would basically get right in as if they were accessing the website directly. And remote users would be required to log in. And we do this with a thing called Open Athens redirector links, or as are sometimes known as Athenized links. So yeah, in this scenario, you could use one URL for both on-site and off-site access. The only thing to note about this is that if you have usage via IP access, it won't appear in our reporting section. So if we're sending a user directly to the publisher, that won't be reported on. We only report on authentication to a publisher via SAML or proxy IP. So the last question here is Open Athens compatible with other tools and applications my library uses? So we did touch on this earlier on, but yeah, Open Athens can power logins to any subscription tool or application that supports IP or SAML access. So that means Open Athens can log your end users into databases and journals, as well as the library's LMS, catalog, interlibrary loan application, Moodle, so on. The only caveat is that application needs to be able to do either IP or SAML access, which pretty much everything does these days. So that's all good. I did see something in the chat about is there about vendors that are non-Open Athens compliant. So yeah, if there's a vendor that isn't Open Athens compliant, then what we generally do is set them up on the proxy for Open Athens. And if they can do IP access, then we can get access to the resource that way. So yeah, is basically entirely dependent on if they support SAML rather than if they support Open Athens. Because there's some publishers that will use other software that will still be SAML compliant. So yeah. Could you grab the next one? Thanks, Amanda. So we've talked about accounts a little bit, and I just want to expand on this in a bit more detail. So what accounts will my users log into with Open Athens is a big question. So there's two types of accounts for Open Athens. We have one type which we call personal accounts, and a personal Open Athens account is data that actually lives in Open Athens. So that's an account that's been created with either a self-registration form or a bulk upload or created in the Open Athens dashboard. So when I say personal account, I mean account that's been created directly in Open Athens. But as we keep talking about, you can actually hook in like your local directory. So that's like CAS or ADFS or G Suite, whatever. So if you wanted to hook in your local accounts, which is the second type, you can also do that. And what happens with local accounts is when a local connection is set up, let's say to ADFS, when a user logs in using that local connector, what will happen is kind of like a provisioning will get done on that account. So we will take the attributes from that account from whatever's been sent to us. We will save that for a specified time as set by the admin in the admin area. And then, yeah, that account will be able to log in to resources. So that's called just-in-time provisioning. So we provision the accounts as they log into Open Athens. You don't have to like make a connection to a local directory and upload everything into there all in one go. We do it just in time. So as users are logging in, accounts get created for them so they can log into Open Athens. So that was quite a lot. So I'm just going to cut that back again. So there's two types of accounts. You have accounts created in Open Athens, and then you have accounts created from local directories. The ones that live in Open Athens are personal accounts, so you can make them with self-registration forms, and I think EBSCO has a service, and we have a service where we can build one for you, or you can use our API as well and make one yourself. Bulk upload, so that's a feature inside the Open Athens admin area where you can bulk upload like a spreadsheet or something of a list of users if you wanted to have them live in Open Athens. And then also you've got your local directory. So your local directory is just-in-time provisioning from your local data source. So that's creating accounts on the fly and then having that data revoked for whenever you specify. So you could have local accounts deleted within every month or every year if you wanted to. It's up to you. Great. Thanks, Amanda.
All right. So next, we're actually going to jump out of our slides and jump into a live dashboard to sort of show you some of the features that we've talked about so far. So I'm just going to bring this right over here. We work closely with the library at Millersville University, and they have been so kind as to give us permission to share some of their configuration with the folks on today's session. And we love this because Millersville have been using Open Athens for, I think, almost 2 years now. So they're well into their Open Athens usage. They've improved upon and optimized their setup. And I think they just have a really interesting example of how Open Athens is deployed for their subscriptions as well as some shared access they have with sister schools. So what we're looking at here is the area of the Open Athens dashboard where we configure connections to identity providers. And you'll see over here on the left-hand side that we actually have 4 SAML identity provider connections set up. And the reason for this is because Millersville has dual institution programs where students who are enrolled in certain academic programs should be able to access not just their own library, but also Millersville's library. So it's a cooperative reciprocal program that they have set up. And when they were approaching Open Athens, one of the big questions that we needed to ask was how we were going to configure that sort of reciprocal shared access using multiple identity providers. And so what we've done is we've actually set up a connection for each of these different institutions to access Millersville's library resources. And you'll notice that these are all SAML-based connections, but when we're talking about what local authentication systems we can connect to, this is the part of the dashboard where you can choose. So if we're connecting to anything SAML-based, and per a few of the questions I saw in the chat, we can connect to a CAS server as long it is SAML compliant, which means we can connect to CAS version 5 and later. So anything that's SAML-based, the connection is actually going to be fairly predictable. We will ingest the metadata URL from your identity provider. And once we do that, we will ask you to ingest Open Athens SAML metadata into your settings. When we set that up, I want to go back to a conversation about data, because I think a lot of our conversations about the technical aspect of Open Athens really all lead back to user data and walking that line between access and granularity of visibility, but also retaining some anonymity. So when we connect to an identity provider, we require only some attribute that can be used to uniquely identify a user. So that can be anything that both exists on every user account, but that is persistently unique on every user account. Now, I'm sure if you manage an identity provider right now, you're thinking of any number of data attributes that can be used that fit that bill. But for institutions who really want to keep things completely non-PII, it is important to note that this persistent user identifier can be anything you want. So we work with many libraries who choose to pass us ID number. That's persistently unique, and it can help the Open Athens service tell one account from another, but at face value, it is not personally identifiable to anyone who might see it. So this library in particular chose to use email address, but for this one single mandated attribute, you can use anything you like. And from there, if you choose to pass additional attributes, you can, but it's not required. So there are a few different reasons why a library or an IT team would choose to share additional attributes with the Open Athens service. The first is for the purposes of permissions. So if you need to be able to reliably identify members of different groups to manage different authorizations and group access, Open Athens can use that data to help enforce those rules. So for example, Millersville are sharing an attribute with Open Athens that tells us somebody's affiliation. So this is actually going to tell us whether somebody is a staff member, a faculty member, or a member of the student body. From there, we can actually set up if-then permissions rules. So we can say if the affiliation attribute contains the word faculty, then this user is a member of the faculty group. And from there, when a user is a member of the faculty group, they have access to a specific subset of resources. So it's a very simple if-then structure where we can rely on the data being managed in your identity provider to enforce authorizations. Now, the other reason a library might choose to share different attributes, as you might have gathered from looking at some of this information, is for reporting purposes. So perhaps you share subscriptions between different libraries, maybe different branches or campuses, or maybe you share subscription costs broken down by academic department or different groups of some other nature. If that data is managed in your directory, then it can be used for your usage reports. So right now, whenever a faculty member logs into the Open Athens service, for example, we have been permitted to see which department that faculty member belongs to. So then And I apologize, we don't have time for a full tour of the Open Athens report area, but when we jump into our reports, we can actually see how much usage is coming in from each of those faculty departments. So what we're looking at here is a day-to-day breakdown of total number of logins broken down by all of the different departments that are managed in Millersville's identity provider. So as you might imagine, this is a level of visibility that in some cases can help the library monitor, share information with stakeholders, or perhaps even make decisions about how subscriptions are shared. Now, I do want to mention a few more things about data. First and foremost, Open Athens reports do not report at the user level unless the library specifically customizes their reports to do so. So Open Athens reports are designed to be anonymous by default. By default, the only metrics that are tracked are how many logins occur to different resource platforms, or if you have permission sets in groups, how many logins are coming from each of those different groups. From there, the library does have the ability to actually say which attributes should be measured in your reports. So for example, Millersville wanted to see how many logins were coming from each academic major. So they could come in here and make this what we call reportable. That is a customization made at the discretion of the library. And so that means, again, we can see a breakdown by that attribute. Now, some libraries do have a need for user level data. Maybe they need to compare individual user usage with academic outcomes, something like that. So if that is the case, you can choose to make something user level reportable, maybe email address or ID number, targeted ID. This is, again, at your discretion, and we hope that these controls help libraries retain anonymity if that's what they need to do, but also if they need to achieve user level data, it may help them achieve that as well at their discretion. Now, I do want to note, this is a question I saw in the chat, that Open Athens is, being that it's an authentication service, its primary aim is to validate that a user has a valid user account and then pass that person to the target platform where they're trying to log into. From there, if that user is navigating around, putting in search queries, downloading content, etc., the Open Athens service does not have visibility of that behavior. So what's important to know is that the Open Athens service cannot report on what titles I'm accessing or what articles I'm downloading. It can only report when I access at a platform level. So I'm accessing EBSCO, or I'm accessing my ILL service, and so on and so forth. And finally, again, going back to data, I do want to quickly show you where the library can come to manage attribute release. So for example, most providers actually do not require any personally identifiable data in order to accept SAML single sign-on. But as Jake mentioned earlier, there are some cases where a library might want to pass, for example, maybe first name. Maybe when I log in using SAML single sign-on, as long as that provider is receiving first name, then it'll greet me by name. And that might be a friendlier user experience. So in that case, you can actually say what data should be shared with that individual provider when somebody logs in. Or you can say, we don't want that data shared. And what this really does is it puts some really unique control in the library's hands to say which data should be sent where, or in most cases actually to say that no data should ever be shared during the authentication handshake. So when somebody logs into a provider platform using Open Athens, what the provider sees at a baseline is just the Open Athens assigned targeted ID, which is not personally identifiable at face value, rather it's an opaque identifier. And so in the interest of time, I'm just going to come back into my and just to recap, Open Athens does not require PII to be shared for it to authenticate and authorize users per whatever you need set up. You can choose how long local directory data interacts with your Open Athens dashboard, and the library can control data attribute release. So that authentication and personalization can be supported with just that opaque identifier that Open Athens assigns to the user, the targeted ID. All right. So, and Jake, I'm going to just say we have 10 minutes left. So in the interest of time, we will give an overview here, but we can make more information available at request to any folks who want it after the call.
Sure, and I've also seen we've got some great questions coming through. So yeah, let's make this one a quick round. So with reporting, what kind of stories can we tell? So I think that was like a great overview that Amanda just did then. This we'll just go into it a little bit more. So we can look at user account activity. So that's to do with successful versus failed logins, to total versus unique logins. That last one sounds a bit tricky. So total versus unique. What that's really saying is that if I logged in to say that JSTOR resource today, and then I also logged in on my mobile device, that would be one unique login, but two totals for my individual account. So that could be super useful for when you're looking for your reporting. We've got the resource usage activity. So that's total logins to each platform. As Amanda says, we're interested in the authentication and making sure that user is being passed. Once they're passed to the publisher and sent their attributes across, then we don't, track that user or anything like that. The user is then on that website. So we can report that they've logged into that platform, but what they've done on that platform, Open Athens doesn't know because we don't track users. And breakdown reports by group, permission set, individual data attributes, and yeah, whatever attributes you throw at us, really. So that was a great demo Amanda just did then. So yeah, if we could get to the next one, thanks. So here is a daily usage broken down by provider platform. So that thick red line at the top is the total, and then the dotted one will be the unique users. So yeah, and as you can see, this is a all resources breakdown. So yeah, there's a bunch of stuff there, and different colors represent different publishers. Here's a custom breakdown for the specific data attribute. So this is what you're sending us. So if you were sending us scoped affiliation or usernames and stuff like that, then you can break it down by those. And the next one, thanks. And here's a daily usage broken down by department. So yeah, you're looking at the departments for all resources here, but you could have it scoped to a single resource like EBSCO databases or something like that. And yeah, just to wrap this up as well, we have massive amounts of documentation about reports and how to generate all kinds of different ones and how to schedule them and how to get them emailed to people, all from the admin area. So this is only like a snippet of what you can do with reporting. You can do way more. So yeah.
All right. So I think we will spend our last few minutes. I'll just go through the questions, and Jake, we can sort of hand it back and forth based on who is most appropriate to respond. And it's true, we have been getting tons of really good questions. So first question we received is, if misuse can be identified at the user level, does that mean that use, including what content each user is viewing or downloading, is being tracked and stored? Just wondering about privacy implications. And I think we've mostly answered that already. Open Athens does track an access to a platform, so it can see if you have a user level breakdown custom set up for your reports, it can see that I accessed the EBSCO platform, say 5 times today, but it does not track what I do after I get there. So it can't see that I accessed the EBSCO platform, searched for A, B, C, D, and F, and downloaded any number of articles. So there isn't the ability to pull what a user is actually reading or searching for post-authentication. Next question. Does licensing of cloud-based service store or snapshot user data? Does the library have control of privacy access, and what is done with the cloud data? And similar to that, the next question is, what kind of log and format of log does Open Athens provide or export? does it allow direct pulling from other log analyzers? And Jake, I may hand that off to you if that's all right.
Yeah, sorry, I've just lost that question on my screen.
So can you see the chat?
Yes. Oh, okay. Yeah. So I see it's been split
Yep.
between question and answer and the chat.
Yep.
So what time was this one? Sorry.
This was at 11:15, 11:17.
Time zones.
Yeah.
Okay, so what kind of login format of log does Open Athens provide export? So we don't provide at the moment direct pulling via an API, but it's actually on our roadmap because we've been requested this from our customers. So when customers request features to EBSCO or Open Athens directly, then we take that for a development process. So yes, that's definitely on our roadmap to pull data directly out via an API. But at the moment, you can receive emails with either a link to the report and dashboards, but you can also receive like a CSV sheet and get the raw data that way as well. But if you want to do anything with like APIs or getting format which is custom, that's not supported yet, but that is definitely on our roadmap.
All right. So next we have any threshold cutoff for gobble resources from valid user. Is there a threshold by library and or by said vendor? And Jake, I may hand this off to you as well.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I've never been asked that before. So we don't have a threshold per publisher. So you can access a publisher as many times as you would like, but there is services in the background which is monitoring this sort of stuff. So if there was someone that was authenticating way too many times or across way too many different countries, and it will get picked up in our automated misuse service. And that's the same with proxy resources as well. So if someone's gobbling up proxy resources, then that will get flagged in our misuse service, and an email would get sent to the administrator with the account in question. But if like a user logged in with SAML to a publisher and then started downloading PDFs and stuff, that's actually at the service provider level. So that service provider would be doing monitoring on their end to look for that sort of stuff. So if there was an issue, they would normally contact either Open Athens, EBSCO, or maybe even the institution in question. So yeah, that's my answer to that, if that made sense.
Sure, thank you. So one of the next questions we have is whether publishers have access to the unique identifiers that are assigned to each user account. And again, I think we saw this during the demo, but just to recap, Open Athens requires that some unique identifier be shared from your identity provider. So that could be anything of your choosing. And the goal there is to let the Open Athens service tell each account apart. So that is how we support personalization. That's how we support those security protocols where we can detect misuse down to the user level. But from there, that user identifier that you shared with us does not need to extend to a publisher when somebody logs in. So if you want to rely completely on the targeted ID that Open Athens assigns to an account for the authentication and personalization handshake, that is possible. So any data that you share with Open Athens can be used to uniquely identify users, or additional data can be used to support reporting and permissions, but there's no requirement that you then need to share any of that data with publishers when somebody's logging in through the service. All right, next question. Are we still required to purchase or subscribe to certificates as required by Proquest or Easy Proxy? The answer to that is no. We hear often of wildcards too with regard to certain proxy services. That is also not required. And Jake, I'll let you confirm this from your standpoint since you're closer to it, but to my knowledge, the Open Athens hosted proxy service doesn't require any maintenance from the customer whatsoever. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So if you were using the managed proxy service, we set you up with a hosted IP, and we deal with the rest really. So you don't have to buy certificates or anything like that. We will manage all of that stuff.
Thank you. All right, so we have reached time. I'm happy to continue talking through questions, but Kim, who helped organize the webinar, I'm actually going to defer to you. Would it be easier to make these questions available after the call in a follow-up to all of our attendees?
Definitely, we can keep going if people stick around, but we can answer these questions afterwards in an email.
Okay, perfect. So if you're attending but you need to drop off for anything else, feel free to do so, and you can receive all of these answers in an email following. But Jake, if you're able, I'm happy to keep talking through these.
Yeah, sure.
All right, perfect. So our next question, with regard to the implementation and transition, would there be a redirect for any period of time from an old IP authentication provider, or will we need to update every link provided in a short amount of time? This is absolutely a great question. We talk through this quite a bit with libraries who are sort of trying to imagine what their implementation will look like and what will be needed. And I think most commonly we're talking about migrating from some other proxy service to Open Athens. In those cases, a lot of times you may already be using a link-based service where you have a prefix on your URLs. And I think the concern is always, will my legacy proxy service stop working, or will it end as soon as we launch Open Athens? And the answer to that really is that our recommendation is to continue running your legacy proxy for at least a month or so while we're launching Open Athens. And it may seem a little bit backwards if you're looking to migrate your authentication solutions, but based on our experience working with libraries on implementations, we find that if a library has a mass of, say, easy proxied links, it is much easier to update those links to use Open Athens over the course of a month while you have still have easy proxy access rather than updating everything in a single day. And I do also want to point out too that our implementation team does take on link updates for any links that live in the EBSCO platform. So if you use permalinks in eHost or EDS or Full Text Finder, those are some applications where we update links for you based on when you want to launch Open Athens. So if you're starting to sort of conceptualize what your link update process will look like, again, we do find that libraries, what we hear from libraries is that running your legacy solution for a period of time during Open Athens launch can give you a little bit of a cushion time-wise for updating those links. And also there are some applications where if our teams have access, we can update links for you. All right, so next question, is it possible to share an example of a consortium that is using Open Athens? So we do have quite a few consortia using Open Athens right now across a variety of markets. And the system is really successful at being flexible to sort of scale to those different types of hierarchies. So Susanna, my recommendation, and to anyone else who has the same question, would be to reach out to your contact at EBSCO, either your sales rep or your support rep, and send that question through them, because based on what type of library you work in, we can give you some references that are most appropriate and probably can help answer your questions. So we can definitely help get you the information you need. Next question, is the trapping or disabling of accounts a default setting? Could a university with education buildings servicing students who are distant from the main campus have situations where students leave the branch building on the university network and continue their session on a coffee shop network, which has a network address and which is registered 1,000 miles away from that university branch? Or will students find their account blocked when they leave the branch location and it's different geographic location. And so Jake, again, I'm going to kick this one to you. I think it has a lot to do with how sessions persist if you're moving locations or IPs.
Yeah, so when you actually log in as an end user of Open Athens, you get a Open Athens session, and that session, I think it stays with you for about, you might have to back me up here, Amanda. I think it's 8 hours.
Yep, that is correct.
Yeah, there we go. So yeah, you have an 8-hour session with your account, and if you've logged on, like say with your laptop and you've been accessing stuff, and you move to a different network, in this example, you wouldn't get blocked. But the kind of misuse I'm talking about is that if a user account logged in, I don't know, somewhere in the States, then logged into somewhere from Greece, and then logged into somewhere from Japan, then obviously that's pretty impossible within, say, like an hour. So we've got like automated services to pick up stuff like that. But yeah, if someone was just logging in and then they go on a road trip, it's not going to block their account. If an account gets blocked as well, it will be reported to the admin of the Open Athens admin area. So it's not like you won't have visibility of it as well. So if there is a case like that and it gets blocked, then you could definitely raise a ticket if you think it shouldn't have been blocked. But we haven't had any issues with our misuse service. So
Perfect. Thanks, Jake. All right, our next question. What is the time frame to implement Open Athens? Now I'll start by mentioning first, based on our experience with our implementation team, that an Open Athens implementation time frame is it can fluctuate based on the number of vendors that we're reaching out to update your authentication. So as you might imagine, a library who has, say, 15 subscriptions, that will be a relatively streamlined implementation process, as opposed to a library who has 400 vendors who our team is reaching out to one by one. So that said, I will say that right now, the Open Athens implementation timeframe is about 15 weeks. And again, that is directly correlated to the number of vendors we reach out to. I think we covered pretty extensively today that the Open Athens service is designed to take all of the technical configuration off of your plate. So that federated single sign-on structure, that hosted proxy service. And in the same vein, our implementation process is really designed to take any of the implementation work, that busy work reaching out to vendors, off of your plate as well. So EBSCO's team here, we have vendor contact specialists who help us conduct all of that correspondence. But yes, the number of subscriptions is impactful on the implementation timeline. So if you're interested in getting more information specific to your library, again, my recommendation would be to reach out to your EBSCO contact, either your support or sales rep. We do have a team who assists our sales department with assessing vendor lists, essentially. So if you provide a list of just the vendors that you purchase subscriptions from, we can give you a better idea of, we can tell you what is compatible from your list of subscriptions. So we can tell you who is established in the Open Athens Federation or on the hosted proxy service, but also our implementation team can give a more accurate expectation of how long your particular implementation would take. So that is my recommendation. And if you do submit a vendor list to us, if you are contacting us from a group of institutions or a consortium, that is relevant as well. So just let us know. All right, so next question is about the percentage of resources that are currently going through the hosted proxy service versus through Open Athens federated single sign-on. And Jake, I will kick that one over to you.
yeah, so this is interesting because all of the information about people in the Open Athens Federation is publicly accessible. So if you did like a Google search for RefEd's metadata explorer and then looked at the Open Athens Federation, you'll get a list of all the institutions in the federation. Percentage between IP proxy and SAML, I don't have a number, but I believe that IP is bigger. And the reason for that is that we have, when we set up like a customer, let's say they have 200 publishers to implement, they may have like a subscription to a big platform, let's just say EBSCO, and that EBSCO platform might cover lots of their resources, but then the rest of their resources might be smaller publishers that only do IP access. So either we've already got them covered, or we would actually set up the IP proxy for that customer. So I would say that because of the majority of smaller publishers out there at the moment, IP is probably bigger, but the SAML one is definitely growing, and the number of platforms on the Open Athens Federation doesn't necessarily reflect that that's only one service, because you could have one platform. A great example is like Elsevier. So Elsevier provide lots of different services like Scopus and Science Direct, but they group it all under one thing, which is Elsevier SP. So yeah, it's kind of hard to work out that percentage in real numbers, but I would say that IP is probably bigger because there's more smaller resources that libraries subscribe to.
All right, thank you. Our next question is about compatibility. We have, does Open Athens connect with all of the major library systems? So I would go back to the rule that we sort of live by when we're talking about compatibility, which is that Open Athens can power logins into any content or applications that accept SAML or IP access. So if you currently use some IT managed single sign-on or shibboleth alongside, say, IP access and proxy service, then all of that same access will be encompassed under the Open Athens umbrella. But what I also will note is that if everyone who wants to, can you direct your attention to the chat? I believe our colleague Kim could put a link in the chat. Yep, it's there at 8:56 a.m. or I'm sorry, 11:56 a.m. And this is a link to a page where there will be more information posted. So we can post a link to the real-time list of vendors and publishers who have been set up with Open Athens to date. So if you're interested in inquiring about particular vendors or platforms, you can take a look there. Or of course, you can submit those questions to your EBSCO support or sales rep, and we'll give you an assessment. Moving on, small affiliate group that is only known by text account or number, can we import that into Open Athens with the same full access and control? So you can perform a bulk upload into the Open Athens system that would create accounts that live and are managed in the Open Athens dashboard for those users. So if you want to use only an account number or an ID number to identify those users, you can use that as the persistent identifier for those accounts. Now, for accounts that are created within Open Athens, the system does currently require first name, last name, and email address to be included. But in the past, we have seen libraries who don't want to share that data, just use, say, an initial or some dummy information, just filling those fields out. So it is possible to import information and create accounts that way. We would refer to that as a bulk upload. Is it possible to use the Alma Patron database as our local directory connection? And this is a really interesting question. I also saw another question later on about whether Open Athens can work with Alma from Ex Libris. So we'll answer both of those together. With regard to the Patron database, and Jake, I might rely on you a little bit for this because I actually haven't explored this question before. But I would say that Alma is not meant to be used necessarily as an identity provider. But if no other identity provider is available, and that is absolutely the only place where you store your patron data, we would want to explore whether we could connect to it via Open Athens Account Management API. So that would just take a little bit of fact finding and vetting from our teams, but we could work that out if that's something that you wanted to talk through. But Jake, have you encountered that question before?
No, me either. And yeah, I absolutely agree with you. We've done the same before in the past, where we've connected to Circe Dynex, for example, using their API to authenticate accounts in. But yeah, we could we could explore the same options with Alma Patron database. Yep.
Okay, great. And so the second part of that question is whether we can use Open Athens to log into Alma. And the answer to that is a resounding yes. Alma does support SAML logins, and we have set up logins to Alma and Primo for our Open Athens customers before. If you're familiar with your Alma settings, I believe it's called a SAML profile. That would just be how you connect Open Athens to your Alma instance in your dashboard. But if you want to know more, let us know. We can direct you toward the appropriate Ex Libris documentation.
Amanda,
Mhm.
we still have a good amount of people, but maybe we should, you know,
Yeah.
maybe one
Yeah.
more.
Sure,
All right.
sure, absolutely. Okay, one more. I'll just go straight to the next question. Is there any security advantage to using Open Athens proxy service in the front end, even when the vendor only does IP authentication, knowing that the user has to identify themselves through the Open Athens to gain access versus using direct proxy access where the user is anonymous? I'm trying to, sorry, I just need to reread
Yeah.
this.
No, I can take this.
Sure.
So essentially, you would sign in to the proxy service with your Open Athens account, and then it would be like you'd be accessing the resource via the proxy server. So we've actually got our own home-built forward proxy solution. So that's our own hosted service that we've made ourselves. And yeah, when we built it, security was at the foremost of our mind, because other solutions that we've seen, and when people migrate to Open Athens for certain reasons, which yeah, I'll keep it to that, was for security concerns. And when we built the Open Athens proxy service, we wanted to make sure it was secure as possible and basically following web standards as much as possible, because a lot of proxy servers don't actually do that. So if you want the security details about like what we're doing with the proxy server itself, then I could get that in an email and follow up if you're interested. But yeah, what you're essentially doing is logging into the proxy server with your Open Athens account, and then the proxy server is going off to fetch the content securely.
Great. I think that's a wrap, Amanda.
Yes, yeah.
Oh,
Thanks
all
everyone
right.
for attending and
Sounds
for the questions.
Yes, thank you so much for staying late. This was a great session. We'll figure out a plan to follow up with these questions, and the replay will come via Open Athens. So that's it. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great day and stay healthy.
Yep. Thanks all. Bye now.
Bye.